The Shiur today is dedicated to Ilui Nishmosai of Rabbi Sol Yitzchak ben Reb Machor HaKoyen, whose Yorsat is tonight, and Reb Chaim Eliyahu ben Binyamin, whose Yorsat is on Shabbos. These are the father and the father-in-law of one of our precious friends, one of the founders of this Shiur, Rav Birnblut. And the Neshama should have an Aliyah, and they should be Melitzi Yosher for the entire beautiful family. They should only know Nachas and Simcha. So today we start a new Chumash this week, and that is Chumash Shemos. Chumash Beroshis is defined as Sefer HaYetzirah and also Sifron Shel Avos. And Beroshis is all about the story of the Avos, like Doshim, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the 12 tribes, Yud, Beis, Shiftei, Ka, Yosef and his brothers. And one could say that the hero of Chumash Shemos is Moshe Rabbeinu. And his story is also begins in Chumash Shemos. The topic we will be discussing today is not a very lumdish topic, but a very relevant one, an important one, and that is Shaloshinu es Shemam, the very first pasuk in Chumash Shemos. Ve'ele Shemos b'nei Yisrael abo Mitzrayim, Baraturim. And the Baraturim is all about the Ramozim. The Baraturim writes, Ve'ele Shemos b'nei Yisrael abo Rosh Teves Shivyo, being in captivity. She'af keshahoyo b'shivyo, even when they were in Golis, Shemos b'nei Yisrael, Shaloshinu Shemosam. B'shvil shloisha dvarim nigalu Yisrael, Shaloshinu Shemam, Leshonam, Malbusham. They kept on to the traditions of their fathers. They didn't change their names, their tongue. They spoke the holy language even when they were in exile, in Golos, in Mitzrayim. And they tried to wear their own begodim. The Chassam Sofer writes a remez, V'yavoy Yankov Sholeim. Sholeim is 3 letters, Shmam, Leshonam, Malbusham. And that was the merit of Yankov Avinu and his children and his offspring, Shaloshinu es Shemam. And that is the topic we will be discussing tonight briefly. Is it legitimate to carry non-Jewish names? Some of my best friends in Chutz La'aretz, and I won't mention their family names, but I have some great friends and great supporters of Torah, and even Lamdonim, who are, Ralph, Kenny, Bram, and all kind of names who are not Jewish names. How does that fit in with halacha and with tradition and with minhag? So this is a major discussion. Chuvas Maram Shik, and the Maram Shik was one of the great Talmidim of the Chassam Sofer. In Yordei Semakuf Samachtes, he writes, carrying a non-Jewish name is an Issa D'Oraisa. And he's very harsh about this. B'chukoi Seyem lo yitelechu va'avdil eschem minhu amim. And the Maram Shik is very harsh about even using dates, non-Jewish non-Jewish months. And the Maram Shik says, this is against halacha, and it is a prohibition, it is an aveda to carry a non-Jewish name. One of the great Talmidim of the Maram Shik was the Maharshag, Reb Shimon Greenfeld, and he was the semi-Hayaruf in Hungary. And in his response, in his Shuvas Chelik Beisim in Kuf Tzadik Dalet, he says the same. The Ragachava, going over to Latvia, in Dvinsk, the Ragachava in his Sefer, Shuvas Tzafon Spanei Echrei Shayin says the same. Reb Moshe Feinstein has an amazing insight, which is somewhat questionable, controversial. Shuvas Orchaim, Igris Moshe Chelik Dalet Siman Samach Vav. Reb Moshe says there is no problem in carrying non-Jewish names. And was that because Reb Moshe was in America and the others were in Eastern Europe? I don't think so. Halachic ruling is always objective. And Reb Moshe argues, and that's a fascinating argument, Shaloshinu es Shemam Leshonam Levusham was important before Matan Torah. That was the only difference between Jews and non-Jews. They didn't receive Torah yet. Yes, twice in Shas, at the end of the Kiddushin and Yom HaChavches, Chazal say, Kim Avram Avinu Kol HaTorah Kol Ad Sholani, but that was just on a voluntary basis. not all the Jews before Matan Torah observed all the mitzvahs. Tshuvas Haramo argues, we don't find this Mama Chazal only regarding Avram Avinu alone. Kim Avram Avinu Kol HaTorah Kulat Shloinino. Tshuvas Haramo argues that does not include Yitzchak or Yaakov, only Avram. Avram's children and his grandchildren did not observe the mitzvahs ad Shloinino. And that is a big chiddush. We all remember Rashi. Im Lavan Garti V'Taryag Mitzvahs Shomarti. So Rashi definitely disagrees with the Tshuvas Haramo. But anyway, so the Moshe's argument is, Ad Shelo Nitnu Torah, what set us apart was tradition. Shaloshinu Shemam Leshonam Levusham. But La'acham Matan Torah, what defines us as Jews is Taryag Mitzvah Shabbat. It is going to shul 3 times a day and saying Kriya Shema and your talis and your tefillin and your Yomim Tovim and your Shabbos Kodesh. So Shemam Levusham Lishonam is less important than it was in days of yore before Matan Torah. And that's a fascinating argument. I do not think that is a mainstream opinion, and I think it is important throughout the ages, and Jews always try to stand apart. 200 years ago, I don't think we'll have time tonight to discuss that controversy, but the Gzeres HaLavush was a huge halachic controversy. It was in Russia and in Poland, in 2 different countries, in which the authorities decreed that Jews cannot have their own garb and distinctive begodim, and they need to dress like all the others. The Chidush Harim said, Yehereg v'al yavar. The Chayodim quotes the Gaon. The Chayodim wasn't the Talmud of the Gaon. We could say he was a chassid of the Gaon. He was a Talmud of the Noda B'Yehuda, and he quotes the Noda B'Yehuda as Moed V'Rabbi, but he was a mechutn with the Gaon, and when the children married, he came to know the Vilna Gaon. And one of the most fascinating documents about the greatness and the godless of the Gaon is the introduction of the Chayodim to a Sefer Zichru Toras Moshe and Hilchos Shabbos. And the Chayodim quotes the Gaon that complying with Gzeres HaLavush is Yehereg v'al yavar. And he disagrees with the Gaon. He says, I don't understand why. So that was a huge controversy. And that was 200 years ago. So I don't think others would agree with Reb Moshe that after Matan Torah it is no longer important Shaloshinu Shemam Levusham V'Malbusham. But that's the opinion of Reb Moshe Feinstein. And Reb Moshe quotes many great Jewish leaders had non-Jewish names. For instance, Tosfos in Gittin, Daf Ches Amud Beis, quotes Rabbeinu Peter. Anybody that knows a bit about history, Peter is not a very Jewish name. Peter is a very well prominent Christian name, and Tosfos quotes Rabbeinu Peter, and he was in the days of Rabbeinu Tam, one of the Baalei HaTosfos. The father of the Rama, Reb Meir Abulafia, was Todrus, and that's a Spanish name. The Maggid Mishnah's name was Vidal. Vidal, once again, is a Spanish name. The Shara Melech, one of the great Sephardi Achronim, was Nunes Belamonti, which is Italian. So many great Gedolim carried non-Jewish names. And we go back to the days of Chazal. Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, we have no idea what the name Chalafta is and where it comes from. Maybe it was a Jewish name, but in Doron Pei Aleph we find that Vardimos was a son of Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, and Vardimos is a Greek name, and so not only in the days of the Rishonim and the Achronim that Reb Moshe quotes various different great Gedolim that had non-Jewish names, it goes all the way back to Chazal. Vardimos was a son of Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta. Shir HaShirim, Rabbo, Medrash B'Shir HaShirim Perek Gimel, we find Rav Patriki. Patrick is also a very Christian name, just like Peter is, and we find that in Chazal. The most surprising name that we find 3 times in Yerushalmi, Bein Ashar Brochas Pele Gimel Halacha Daled, is Titos. And Titos is a very well-known Gentile, and one of the greatest Rishonim in Jewish history. He destroyed the Bayis Sheni, and we find Titos. Rabbi Yosef Engel, one of his amazing Svarim, Rabbi Yosef Engel was phenomenal. He wrote many Svarim, and one of his Svarim is Gilyonei Hashas. Gilyonei Hashas is a Bekivega. Rabbi Yosef Engel's Sefer, which is similar to Gilyonei Hashas, more lengthy. And in Gilyonei Hashas on the Yerushalmi, he says, it is inconceivable, impossible that Jews will be called Titos. Probably it's a Tos, and it should be Antigonos. Well, Antigonos is also not a Jewish name, but it's not Titos. And there's a Gemara Masechet Yuma, you're not allowed to give a name after a Rasha. So a name Titos is not only a problem of a non-Jewish name, but how could a Jew be called Titos? So Rabbi Yosef Engel argues, probably it's a Tos. The Buchazetzer had a mistake, and it should be Antigonos. But it's a few times in Yerushalmi, so it's unreasonable to say that that is a mistake. So the way I would guess is maybe Titos was a very well-known Roman name. And Titos HaRosha, who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, wasn't the only Titos. Probably there were 50,000 other Roman people who were named Titos, and many Jews who carried that name before Titos HaRosha and after Titos HaRosha. So if a Rasha comes up any time in history and he has a name, that name does not become prohibited. You cannot give a name after a Rasha. And I assume no Jew ever gave a name after Titos HaRosha. But maybe Titos was a very common name, like Joe or Jack or John, and if there's a Rosh Merusha named Joe, or a Rosh Merusha named Yaakov, that doesn't disqualify the name from being used. So we are only aware of one Titos, one and one too many. And he was one of the greatest Rishonim in history, desecrating the Kodesh HaKodeshim, as we learn in Masechet Gittin, destroying the Beis HaMikdash. But maybe the name was carried by tens of thousands of other people and many Jews as well. So I don't share Rabbi Yosef Engel's astonishment. How could an Amoira be named Titos? Actually, in the Yerushalmi, it is Titas. I don't know how to pronounce it, whether it's Titos or, but there is no Vav in there. So, anyway, the Moshe argues, and he brings many examples of Gedolei Yisrael that had non-Jewish names, so it cannot be an Avera. The Maramshik, in the tshuva that I quoted, Kuf Samech Tes in Yordea, and Reb Shloime Kluger as well, in his tshuvas and Shemos Gittin, the Maramshik and Reb Shloime Kluger say, it is prohibited, it's an Avera to have a non-Jewish name, and they quote Toises in Gittin Daf Lamed Daled. In Gittin Daf Lamed Daled, Toises deals, what name do we write in a get? If a Jew converted to Christianity, he became a mumar, a meshumad, and then he gives a get. What name would we write in his get? His Jewish name, but he changed that name. Nobody knows him with his Jewish name. And now he has a new name. And Rabbeinu Tam says, Chas v'sholem, to write his new name in a get. Chas v'sholem, lichtav shem ovid kirchovim beget. And the Maram Shik and Shlomo Kluger quote his Tosfos, arguing that it is an Avera to carry a non-Jewish name. However, I don't think that proves anything. Rabbeinu Tam clearly deals with a name that a person achieved or got upon converting and leaving the fold. And that is the gnai in using this name in a get. After all, a get is a halachic document. And a get is part of our Torah and our Messiah and our halacha. So the Rabbeinu Tam is not against the non-Jewish name, but what the Rabbeinu Tam argues, a name that symbolizes shmad, a name that a Jew achieved upon leaving the faith of his father, the faith of his ancestors. That is a name which is lo yezocher v'lo yeshoma v'lo yepoked in a halachic document, but not because it's a non-Jewish name. That is clear in the Turizov, in Hilches Gittin, Kuf Choftes Siv Kotnei, Yam Shel Shloima, Perek Dalad Masachet Gittin Simen Yud Beis. The Yeshua Yankim in Simen Kuf Choftes goes to the extreme, and he says, if a Jew had a foreign name, he was brought up in a household, and he was given a non-Jewish name, and he converted to Christianity, and he was given a Jewish name upon conversion, Michael, or other names from the Tanakh that Christians use as well. Yeshua Yaakov says, you cannot write that new name in a get. It's a Jewish name. It might be Joseph or Michael, and his previous name, before he converted and left the fold, was a Goyish name. The Bein Tam says, in the get you write his previous name and not the new one. His old name is a Goyish name, his new one is a Jewish name. So the Yeshua Yaakov clearly says, it's not about what is the name. It is about how he got that name and when he got that name. So the Yeshua Yaakov says, if upon conversion, when he became a mumar, not a mumar, but rather a meshumad, and he left the fold, he was given a Jewish name, a name that appears in our Torah, in our Tanakh. You cannot use that name in a get. So it is clear from the Yeshua Yaakov, the problem is not an un-Jewish name. The problem is how and when he got that name. And therefore, this proves nothing. One of the most common Jewish names, which is actually a non-Jewish name, is Alexander. Many Gedolim have the name Alexander or Sender, and Alexander is a Greek name. And Afor Piken, each and every one of us knows a few Alexanders. I think Alexander today is a more Jewish name than a Greek name. I'm not Greek, I don't know what names they use today, but Alexander is a very, very Jewish name. The Seder Hadoros writes a fascinating fact that is not very well known. The Gemara in Yuma tells the story, Alexander the Great, in our sources, Alexander Mogdon, Alexander the Macedonian, he was from Macedonia, which is Greece, and he wanted to conquer Yerushalayim, and he was on his way to fight the Jews, and the Kutim encouraged him. And Shimon HaTzadik, it's a Gemara in Yoma, dressed up in the big day kahuna, left the Beis HaMikdash, and he went out to greet Alexander, and everybody was terrified what's going to happen next. And Alexander sees him from far away. He gets off his horse, he bows down to Shimon HaTzadik, and he gives him tremendous kavod. And the Kutim asked Alexander, these are our enemies, we have come to fight them. Why are you giving so much kavod to this Jew instead of killing him and destroying them and fighting them? And Alexander says, whenever I go out to battle and I am victorious, I see this person going in front of me. And it is a sign from the heavens that I will win this battle. And this is the person that helps me win my battles. And the Seder HaDoros, that's the story told in Masechet Yuma. The Seder HaDoros writes that Shimon HaTzadik plead with Alexander to spare the Beis HaMikdash and leave us alone, go home. And Alexander agreed, but he stipulated, I want my bust in the Beis HaMikdash. That means his statue. You know, kings and rulers and warriors of yore, they were very much into statues. And Alexander demanded, I want my bust in the Beis HaMikdash in the Azorah. Shimon HaTzadik explained, that is impossible, because it is one of our mitzvahs. That is impossible. But Alexander insisted. if you want me to spare the Beis HaMikdash, this is what you need to do. And Shimon HaTzadik offered somewhat of a compromise, and he said, all the Jewish children that will be born in the next 12 months will be named Alexander after you. And Alexander agreed. And he no longer insisted that his image should be in the Beis HaMikdash. And that's a fascinating tradition quoted in the Seder HaDoros. Seder HaDoros was a Gadol B'Yisrael, has no other source. Probably that is how Alexander made its way into Jewish homes, into Jewish tradition, because all the Jewish children that were born in an entire year were named Alexander. And that was the promise that Shimon HaTzadik gave Alexander. So this brings me to a very fundamental idea in this controversy. Many names have made their way into Machane Yisrael. And once they made their way into our communities, they're no longer considered Goyish names. It doesn't depend where the name comes from 100 or 500 years ago. If the Isser is B'chu Koiseyam Lo Teilecho, and that is the argument of the Maramshik and the Marshag and some other Gedolim, it doesn't depend where the name comes from. It depends right here and now. Is that a Goyish name or a Jewish name? And after Shimon HaTzadik promised Alexander, and that was the only way to salvage and save the Beis HaMikdash, that we will call our children Alexander, then after a year or two, when there were 50,000 Yiddish Kinderlach called Alexander, and every cheder was full of Alexanders, of senders, it is no longer an un-Jewish name. It would no longer be considered B'chu Koiseyam Lo. And the same would go to Levush. So, the Klozim Rebbe used to say, and he said it in a humorous way, when Mendel of Vitebsk is Gekimen Kan Eretz Yisrael 200 years ago, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, he didn't bring along his tailor. So probably the first Malbish that he bought in Eretz Yisrael was an Arab tailor, and I don't think that Mendel of Vitebsk taught him how to make his kaftan. And the Klozim Rebbe used to say, that's where these yellow striped begodim come from. But it doesn't matter where it comes from 200 years ago. Today, that's a Yiddish levush. And there's no difference between levusham and shemam. So once a name becomes common amongst Jews, then everybody would agree there would no longer be any prohibition using that name, because who cares where the name comes from? If the Isser is B'chu Koiseyam Lo Telechu, it depends right here and now. And that might be the teretz on all these great Gedolim that had non-Jewish names. We weren't there 100 years ago, or 800 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. Maybe there were 50,000 Jewish Peters. So it would be no wonder that one of the Barataisus was called Rabbeinu Peter.
That would imply that the first one who started there might have either been in a situation like Alexander, which is maybe...
Or he was an Oiver Avera, and maybe he did the wrong thing.
Let's say you have names like, like Shendel, Weiss, and all these very Yiddish nomen, which has nothing to do with the Jewish names. So they all Oiver Avera, the ones who started with those names.
I would assume Shendel. I don't know whether Shendel is a German name in its origin or a Jewish name. Maybe it is a Jewish name. I don't know. But so once again, I didn't finish all the sources yet. I think we should wait a few minutes till I get to all the sources. But let us move on, and then we'll try to wrap things up. But let us continue. Besumem Roish, Simekuf Tzadik. And I think I explained many times, this sefer is not only questionable, today we know it's a fake, it's not a real sefer. So almost 200 years ago, the son of the Rav of Amsterdam printed a sefer Besumem Rosh, and he said that he found shuvas from the Rosh and some of his contemporaries, the Rishonim, and he printed a sefer Besumem Rosh. And Mordechai Bennett came out very harshly against the Sefer. And he said, not only is it a fraud, and there's nothing authentic about it, it's even questionable. And he said some tshuvas are minus nizrakubo. And he said there are some tshuvas that should be totally rejected. And I'm an enikal of Mordechai Bennett. And he said, you're not allowed to keep the Sefer at home. Al tishkan ba'ohel cha'avlo. I do have a b'samim rush, just because today is just a kurios. It's nobody takes this seriously. We know today that it's not an authentic Sefer. But he wants to prove that you could use non-Jewish names. Rabbi Yishmael, one of the greatest Tanoim. What about Rabbi Yishmael? So first of all, Chazal say in Medrash that he did tshuva. But Tosfos asked this question in Yom Daf Lamed Ches. And Tosfos gives such a posheta answer, such a posheta response. Who gave the name Yishmael? HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avram, you're going to have a son, v'karoseh shemo Yishmael. Could anything be bad about a name that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave? So Yishmael is Yishmael, but it is a name that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave. Nothing could be negative about a name that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's what Tosfos says. So this definitely proves nothing. I had a thought, and I think it's Teres Emes. So many Gedolim had non-Jewish names. Okay. The Korban Nesanel was Reb Nesanel Weil. He had a great son who was also Godel B'Yisrael. And his shuvas are called Shuvas Rabbeinu Taya Weil. Theo Weil. Why would a Godel use a non-Jewish name in his Sefer? I had the same question regarding the Zivchei Tzedek. The Zivchei Tzedek was one of the greatest Gedolei Sfarad. He was the Rebbe of the Kaf HaChaim. The Kaf HaChaim was a Talmud of the Zivchei Tzedek, and his name was Rabbi Abdallah Somech. Why would he use an Arab name, an un-Jewish name, Abdallah? And then it occurred to me, Reb Taya Weil's name was Yedidia. Rab Abdallah Somech's name was Ovadia. And I think they didn't want to use the name Yedidia because of the chashash. Maybe it's two words, Yedid, Yud K, and that would be mentioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name. And the same regarding Ovadia, which is Oved Hashem. Yedidia is Yedid Hashem. And that's why they preferred to use the non-Jewish version. Abdallah is actually the same name as Ovadia. And Reb Taya Weil's name was Theophil. Phil is love in Spanish, and Theo is Elokos, theology, theocracy. Theo in Latin and in many other languages is Elokim. So Theophil is Yedid Hashem. Abdallah is Oved Hashem, Eved Hashem. And that is why they preferred to use the non-Jewish version, because they didn't want to use the Shem Yedidia or Ovadia, because they were choshesh. Maybe that would be like a Mazkir Shem Shomayim. I think the most important source in this controversy is Chuvas Maharashdam Kuf Tzadik Tes, because that goes back more than 500 years. And the Tshuva of the Maharashdam was written to Anusei, Sfarad, and Portugal. In the days of the Inquisition, when Jews were forced either to convert or leave the land, and we know in history, and it is also well documented in the Tshuvas, and the Tshuvas of Gedolim are a treasure trove of history. And primarily Tshuvas of the Tashbetz, Rivash. The Tashbetz and Rivash both fled Spain, and they made their way to Northern Africa, to Algiers and to Morocco. And also the Tshuvas Maharashdam, who was in Eretz Yisrael. And the Marashtam as a tshuva, he was asked by Jews. So at the time of the Inquisition, there were three camps. One could say the Jewish community was divided in three. Many left. They left all their wealth, and many of them left their families, and they preferred to leave the land and to live their lives as Jews. And there was mass emigration to Poland, and primarily to Amsterdam. And one of the most magnificent shuls in the world is the Portuguese shul in Amsterdam, which was built many years later by Spanish and Portuguese Jews that fled Iberia, fled Spain and Portugal, and they made their way all the way up to Northern Europe, to Holland, to Amsterdam. So many fled. Many converted, ledavoin leiv. They couldn't stand the pressure and the torture, and they left the fold. And then there were the Marranos, who, in their own private domain, tried to keep as much as they could of Yiddishkeit, and they pretended to convert, and they were hounded and hunted by the Goyim, and they were tortured and killed and hanged, and so some of them that ultimately left the land, and as we know from history, sometimes it was an impossible choice. Parents need to leave their children behind if the children didn't want to leave. Children need to leave their parents, and we could just imagine how painful that was. But anyway, so the Rashdam, Chuvas Marashdam, was asked by those that left Spain and Portugal, but all their friends knew them by their Goyish names because they pretended to convert. So all their business partners and associates knew them by their Goyish names. But now they're free Jews in Amsterdam or in Poland or elsewhere. Could they still use their non-Jewish names in their correspondence and the business dealings with the Goyim that they left behind in Spain and in Portugal? And the Marashdam says, there's no problem at all. You could use your names not only when you deal with your shutfim that you left behind, but with whomever you want. And the Marashdam doesn't see a problem in a Jew carrying a non-Jewish name. And that is the most important source, because the Marashdam goes back more than 500 years. So Libi Yoimali, and now I come to the conclusion of what I think about this entire sugya. How do we understand this sugya? Libi Yoimali. It all depends on the circumstances and the reason why are you carrying a non-Jewish name. The Malamshi cries out, "Va'avdel eschem min ha'amim, va'atem tiyu li zgula mekol ha'amim." You stand apart. You are my chosen people. The Malamshik lived in a day and age. That was the time of the Haskalah and the beginning of the reform movements. And so many people left the fold. Entire frum communities were decimated. And Kehilas fell one after the other like dominoes, to the Haskalah. And the Talmidim of the Chassam Sofer, they was the ones to make a stand and to fight this battle. So it is no wonder that in his day and age, the Malamshik thought it is so important to do everything, to fight the trend, which was to leave Yiddishkeit. All my friends in America that carry an non-Jewish name, they're going nowhere. They're all tzaddikim and bnei Torah, Talmidei Chachomim, Anshe Chesed. So this is not a definitive halacha. It all depends. Where are you coming from and where are you going? So some people just feel it more comfortable in the Goyish world, to have names that are easy to pronounce and don't arouse any special curiosity, and it's just more comfortable. And I don't think that should be any issue. The guy comes into his office with long tzitzis and a big black velvet yarmulke, so yes, they call him Kenny. They call him, so what? So what? He's not, he's Jewish. It's obvious that he's Jewish, and he's very proud to be Jewish. And in that case, there would be no problem of using a non-Jewish name. So in the days of the Marashdam, the people that turned to the Marashdam, could we use our non-Jewish names? Those are people that were moist nefesh for Yiddishkeit. They left behind everything they had. They left behind their businesses and their wealth just to be able to live as Jews. So they weren't trying to assimilate. They stood proud to be Jewish, and they were moist nefesh for Yiddishkeit. So this halacha all depends on the circumstances, on the court of the times, and it is not a definitive halacha. But chukasem lo telechu is a totally different sugya. And shaloshinu is shemam. I had a thought. Maybe the shaloshinu is only if you change your language, your name, and your levush. And if you're trying to change all three of them, that proves that you're not in a good place. If you want to change your entire identity, shmam, levusham, leshoinam, then you're not in a good place. But if people are totally devoted and dedicated to Torah and to mitzvahs, and proudly so, I don't think there would be any problem using non-Jewish names, as I tried to explain. In Pnimius, it definitely is better to use Jewish names than non-Jewish names. But all the people I am quoted, in Shul, they use Jewish names. It is only in their business dealings that they use non-Jewish names. One of my closest friends is, many people know him as Henry. To me, from day one that we got to know each other, he was always Chaim. And I have a very dear friend who, in the business world, is known as Ralph, and to me, from day number one, it was Raphael. I definitely think it is preferable to use a Jewish name, and a very dear friend I have who's known as Kenny, and to me he was always Yechiel. So it definitely is preferable to use a Jewish name, a holy Jewish name. The Chassam Sofer in Parshas Korach writes, Vayikach Korach, as I'll say, and Rashi brings it, Mekach lo lokach la'atzmai. And the Chassam Sofer says, the first terrible thing he did was this awful name of Korach, because Korach was one of Alufei Esav. So he shouldn't have had that name. That's not a good name. Korach was one of Alufei Esav. So the Chassam Sofer writes in Pnimius, and this is a frightening assumption. He writes that a name has a hashpah on your personality, on your spirituality, on your ruchnius, and that is why Korach messed up his life. And the first negative thing about him was his name. Ramami Pano writes in Mayan Ganim, one of the swarm of the Ramami Pano, and the Ramami Pano was one of the Italian Gedolim, and one of the great Mekabolim of his day and age. We have the Shalas Teshuvas Ramami Pano, so obviously he was a Poisik and a Godel B'Yisrael, but better known for his Kabbalah. And in Sefer Mayan Ganim, on this week's Parsha, he writes that Miriam and Yocheved were given names Shifra and Pur by Paroi, and those were Egyptian names, because Paroi knew as long as they carry the names Miriam and Yocheved, they will never carry out his decrees. A Jew cannot do that. He hoped that by changing their names to Shifra and Pur, which were Egyptian names, that'll affect their neshama, that'll affect their pnimius, that'll affect their ruchnius, and then they will comply and they will cooperate with those terrible decrees. So Ramame Pana writes, they did not use those names. They continued to call themselves Miriam and Yocheved. Dafke Chazal, also quoted by Rashi, have a positive interpretation of Shifra and Pur, but that is not what the Ramami Pano writes. Or maybe, yes, they were Egyptian names, but because these were two great tzedekos, v'lo yishamu b'dvar paroi, Chazal give a positive connotation to those names that Paro gave them. So, what we learn from the Ramami Pano, also quoted in the Bnei Yisachar and Chodesh Nisan and the Sam Sefer, that using non-Jewish names would have some effect on your ruchnius, on your spirituality, and your personality. So it definitely is always preferable to use Jewish names, but it is not halachically forbidden to use a non-Jewish name.
Moshe Kusiel?
Yekusiel, I don't know, but Moshe's name was also Yekusiel. My Rebbe's name was Yekusiel, one of the greatest Gedolim of our era.
I'm saying, you see, the Abishter used the non-Jewish name, the name from Bas Parah.
Yeah. Who could say that Moshe is a non-Jewish name? You know? Yes. So Bas Parah called him Moshe, but that is all Ruach HaKodesh. We don't go back that far. You know, Moshe is the most Jewish name ever. You know, that's Moshe. That was Ruach HaKodesh.
Everything Rose spoke about was about the first name. Did there any kula on the second name since they were added later?
Yeah. I don't think the Peda is on the second name. Actually, we started today's Shiur with Maram Shik. It is said, I don't know where it's written, but this is very commonly known, that in our tradition there were no family names. You know, going back all the way to Chazal, it is Rabbi Kiva ben Yosef and Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta and Rabbi Chalafta ben Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda bar Iloi, and Jews were always called by their father's name, and that is what we do in every halachic document, whether it's a ksuba or a get or tanoim. We don't use it. Family names are a goyish idea which was imposed on the Jewish community. And you know, the research of names is very fascinating. So some Jews prefer names, colors. We have Schwarz, Weiss, Bloi, Green. These are very common Jewish names. Some preferred nature, which is Rosenberg, Rosenzweig, Rosenblum. The bloom is a flower, and a rose. And so it is said that the Maram Shik's family, when it was imposed on them to choose a name, they chose Shik, and Shik is Rosh Hashanah, Shem Yisrael Kodesh. And that's the Rosh Hashanah of Shik, and that was the family name of Maram Shik. And when it was imposed on them to choose a non-Jewish name, they wanted a very Jewish non-Jewish name, a very Jewish family name, because family names are alien to our tradition. Jews never had family names. So the Maram Shik's family was Shik, and that is the Rosh Hashanah of Shem Yisrael Kodesh, and that's why they chose that name. So today we discussed an interesting sugya, which is Negeya Halocha Lamaisa, and that is names bebeis Yisrael. What is most important, as I explained towards the end of today's Shiur, is why? Why do you prefer a non-Jewish name? Are you trying to flee your identity? Are you trying to change? Are you uncomfortable with who you are and where you belong? And then it would be wrong. But in our day and age, you know, most of the people in our communities using non-Jewish names are proud, gewaltige Gitte Yidden. So that would be no problem. So Moshe Rabbeinu names his first son, Gershom, Ki ger hoyisi be'eretz nochriya. Why is that a reason to name your son? Names always have a positive connotation. Yehuda, Hapam Oides Hashem, Hapam Yelove Ishi Elai, Levi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu heard my prayers, and that's Shimon. Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ki geri isi be'eretz nachriya. He doesn't say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu helped me. So why would that be a reason to name your son? Rav Moshe Feinstein had an amazing thought, and Moshe says, I am happy and proud that I feel like a stranger. I don't feel at home. Moshe Rabbeinu was born be'eretz Mitzrayim. He knew no one else. But he says, Ki geir hoyisi be'eretz nachriyo. I felt it so strongly every moment of my life. This is not home. This is not where I should be. And that is why Moshe gives his firstborn son a name Gershom, thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu that I feel like a ger, I feel like a stranger. We are living in a time in which, yes, we are made to feel ger ho'isi be'eretz nachriyo, with this horrific rise in anti-Semitism in the entire world. So people call me all the time, should we make aliyah? And if you judge by numbers, factually, Israel is the most dangerous place in the world for a Jew to live. Because we're losing people to terror on a steady basis. And sometimes it barely makes the headlines. There was a horrific terror attack in Sydney, Australia, some time ago. And I very well personally knew some of the people that were killed there. But still, we are losing more people in Israel to terror than the entire Jewish world. But this is home, and this is where we should be. And this is the land that Kodesh Baruch Hu promised to Avram, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov, and to Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is where we call home. And this is where we feel at home. And this is where we feel confident, regardless of the numbers, and regardless of terror. This is where a Jew feels and should feel at home. This is Eretz Kodshenu, Eretz Avotenu. So Moshe Rabbeinu was born in Mitzrayim, and he names his firstborn son Gershom, and he thanks HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ki geir ho'isi be'eretz Mitzrayim. I know that this is not home, and I know this is not where I should be, and I don't intend to stay here. So Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't zeicher to come into Eretz Yisrael, but he brought us all the way, and he is gratified to stand on the mountain looking into Eretz Kodshenu and looking at his Jewish camp and saying, Baruch Hashem, I brought them all home, I brought them all back, even though he did not have the zchus to come into Eretz Yisrael. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's Shiur, we start Chumash Shemos, defined by the Ramban as Sefer HaGolos VaGeulah. And I said, if Chumash Bereishis is all about the Ovis, Chumash Shemos is primarily the persona of Chumash Shemos is definitely Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu, it is clear in Bavli, in Yerushalmi, in Midrash Chazal, beyond dispute, beyond question, Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest individual ever to live, ever to walk the face of earth. And he reached heights no one else ever reached or could reach. Not the Avos, not Malchi Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu, Yevomes Memtes, and many other sources was the greatest individual. What do we know about Moshe Rabbeinu? What do we know about Moshe Rabbeinu before he became Goel Yisrael, before he went before Parai, before he brought the Eden out of Eretz Mitzrayim? What do we know about Moshe Rabbeinu? The very first thing the Torah tells us about Moshe, Vayihi b'yom ha'mehem v'yigdal Moshe v'yetzi alecha v'yar b'sivlotam. Nosen einoi v'liboi, writes Rashi. He not only saw, he felt. He sees the pain of his brethren. Vayar b'sivloisam. Not coincidentally, Nosen einoi v'liboi liois meitzer aleim. He was pained by their plight. And that is the very first thing we learn about Moshe Rabbeinu. He was not only pained, he takes action. And then the Torah tells us, V'yarish mitzri make ish ivri miyechov, and v'yachas mitzri v'yatmineo b'choil. Many people feel the pain, but they're passive about it. They do nothing about it. Moshe Rabbeinu was active. And the other day, b'yom hasheni, shnei ivrim notzim. We might think that Moshe Rabbeinu hates goyim, and that's why he kills the Mitzri to save a Jew. But this time 2 Jews are fighting, and Moshe cannot see, he cannot look on passively. And he intervenes. Rosha lo musaka rayecha. And then to his shock and dismay, mi samcha l'ishav v'shevet, halorgenu ata oimek asher haraktu es a Mitzri. And Moshe is terrified. He looked around, v'yarki ein ish. And then he realizes, ochenoi dehadavar. And this might become public information, which actually happened. And he needs to flee. And he runs away. And he arrives in Midian. And then the Torah tells us story number 4. ולכהן מדיין 7 בונס ותבואנה ותדלנו ותמלנו ושרותם לאשכ ציון אביהם ויבואו הרועים ויגורשום ויוקם מוישה ויושיען וישכ ציונם. Once again, Moshe gets involved. They were chased away by the Royim, and Moshe says, no, this is not right. And Moshe fights the Royim that chased them away. V'yoshiim. You got into trouble once and you need to run away. When will you become sensible? You want to get into trouble again? Moshe cannot see wrongdoing and not intervene. So before we learn about the Torah of Moshe and the Kedusha of Moshe and the greatness of Moshe, all the Torah tells us about Moshe is Vayar b'sivloisam, and he always tries to be helpful, putting his own life in danger, but doing the right thing and being active and not passive and trying to right a broken world, trying to fix a broken world. And that is part of the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the greatness that is demanded and required and expected of every Manig Yisrael, because Moshe is the model of all teachers of Torah throughout the ages and all Manhiga Yisrael throughout the ages. So this Sefer Shemos, is about Golos and Geula. And the Mekabolim, hundreds of years ago, revealed the side of Shoivavim. Shuvu Bonam Shoivavim. Shoivavim is Rosh Tevis, Shmois ve'ero, boi b'shar achisa mishpotim. And these weeks are days which are mesugal for tshuva, for tikkun, and that is in the Shla Kodesh and the Ria Kodesh, going back more than 500 years. And the Baal Shem Tov explained the posuk Korvo el Nafshi Ge'ola in Tehillim, and we say that every Leil Shabbos Kodesh by Kabbalah Shabbos. So the Baal Shem Tov explains that every Jew has his own personal Golos Mitzrayim and his own personal Geulas Mitzrayim. What is that? The Neshama Kedosha, the holy Neshama, comes down to this world, and it is tied together with the Guf. And all the temptations and Yetzer Hara that come together with it. So that is the Golos of the Neshama in this physical world, with all its negativity and nisyonis. And when a person redeems his Neshama and fights his bodily temptations, that is his own personal Geulas Mitzrayim. And when a person achieves his own personal redemption and Geula, that is his contribution to hastening, to bringing forth the Geula Shalema, and that is Korvo el Nafshi Geula. My own Geulas Nefesh is what I can do to bring forth the Geula Shalema. And that is what Shoivavim is all about. When we read the Parshiyos of Golos Mitzrayim and Geulas Mitzrayim. So in days of yore, hundreds of years ago, Chasidim v'anshe Masa used to fast and torment themselves, and that was Tikkun HaShevavim. The great Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov, the Oyev Yisrael, was a Talmud of the Noam Elimelech in Parshas Vayechi, the Bas Ayin, Zera Kodesh, the Rav Shetzarov, the Rebbe of the Divrei Chaim of the Tzanzor in Parshas Boi. They all say, in later generations, Tikkun HaShavavim is Torah. Learn, and learn more and even more. Torah Shebal Peh and Halacha, that is Tikkun HaShavavim. So these days and these weeks, it is a special zgura to add on to our learning. Add on one more shiur, do the Daf Yomi twice, add on some Musa, add on some Halacha. That's Tikkun HaShavavim, Talmud Torah. So let us hope that in these weeks, when we read the Parshios of Golus and Geula, we should be Zoicha to an Itaruta de Tata, should bring an Isarusa de la Eila, and we should be Zoicha to see the Geula Shalema and Bias Mashiach Tzidkenu b'mheru v'yameinu amen.